Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 11. Remote again. Ugh. Hopefully, we'll get some people back tomorrow, maybe. We test early Tuesday morning, and hopefully we'll get more people back on Wednesday, and hopefully we should almost all be here for the rest of the week. We'll see, I guess. Anyway, on to Chapter 11, page 248, 249. We're talking about the president and his job today. And his first job is as Chief Executive Officer, CEO of the nation. The executive makes the laws happen. So Congress just says what should happen, and then the president's in charge of doing it. Obviously, a lot of laws say don't do this, and therefore, if someone does it, the president's in charge of catching them and sending them to jail, or at least sending them to the judge to be sent to jail. But then a lot of laws say to do something. For instance, this last big budget, what was it, the infrastructure bill. I only got like 2 or 3 papers out of you guys, so if you haven't sent me your infrastructure bill paper, please do that. Uh, anyway, if Congress says we're going to spend all this money building a road and whatever, it's the president's job to take that money and hire construction workers to go build the road and the bridge and the internet and whatever. Right? So the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He takes care that the laws are done, either obeyed by doing something or obeyed by not doing something. If Congress passes a speed limit law, then it's the Department of Transportation that enforces it. See, it's not the president himself that enforces everything, obviously. The president is just in charge of hiring people to enforce the law through lots and lots and lots of bureaucracy, little guys, little departments like the Department of Transportation that's in charge of roads and bridges and railroads and whatnot. Maybe you've heard of the term red tape, which means just how sometimes doing something very simple can require 100 different people's approvals and could take 6 months. And it's like, why do we need to fill out all this paperwork and all these forms and all these signatures and stamps of approval? That's called a bureaucracy. Bureaucracy literally means rule by a desk, a bureau. Cracy, like democracy means rule by. So imagine just a bunch of pencil pushers sitting at a desk making a lot of decisions day by day, filling out a lot of paperwork. That's the president's office here. There are lots of different groups within the executive branch, such as the Executive Office of the President, 15 different cabinet level departments, which we will look at in future lessons. Originally, there was Secretary of State, Department of State, Department of War, Department of the Treasury. What was the fourth one? The mail, post office, and that was like it. Now we have 15. And then lots and lots and lots of smaller organizations and corporations, which we'll look at. Is that next chapter? Is the bureaucracy? Chapter 11, next chapter we're going to look at the bureaucracy a lot more. Over 2 million people work for the president. That is a very, very large branch. Now, when you think of Congress, and Congress has just over 500 members, you might think, well, that's a lot of people. And, they all have their own secretaries and people. I think most of them have 2 or 3 people working for them. So you could say several thousand people work for Congress, but 2 million people work for the president. That's a lot of people. Yes, it takes more people to do the laws rather than just to write the laws. Anyway, the president, originally, the president was paid 25 grand a year. That's how much Washington would have made, 25 grand a year. That was bumped up to $200,000 a year in 1969, and then they doubled it to $400,000 a year 30 years later in 2001. So that's a lot of money, and that is straight to their bank account. They have to pay almost no expenses in the 4 years that they are in office. So obviously they're not paying rent on the White House. They get free housing. And I don't want to guess what rent would be in that neighborhood of Washington, D.C. For a house that big would be millions a month. I'm not even joking. They get $50,000 a year for expenses, which means just general budget, whatever you're spending money on, shoes, a new suit, a new tie, snacks, gas for your car or your jet, whatever, 50 grand a year just for expenses. So they're not poor by any means. They get 19 grand for entertainment. And I'm not talking about just buying a big TV and a Netflix account, although I can almost guarantee you that all presidents since Netflix has been around have had their own Netflix account. I wonder what they would call it. POTUS Netflix. Anyway, we're talking about things like tickets to Broadway and football games and baseball games. They are expected to go. These are not just for the president's entertainment, although that's part of it. Perks for being a president. This is also so that the president can make public appearances. When there is a national phenomenon like Hamilton going on in Broadway, the president has to be there. And President Obama was at Hamilton, I think, multiple times. If there's a Red Sox versus Yankees game, that is classic Americana, and the president's got to be there. And of course, they're not getting the cheap seats. They're getting very, very expensive seats, usually their own enclosed glass box for security reasons, and obviously a lot of seats around them for all their security guards. And that really racks up the money in entertainment. I mean, some Americans don't make 19 grand a year, and they're getting that much just for their entertainment. They get $100,000 in a spending account labeled travel, medical, and dental. So obviously the best doctors of all kinds, best dentists. And most presidents are getting rather elderly, including ours right now and our last president. And so they're going to have plenty of medical issues that need to be treated, sometimes pretty hefty surgery. And then travel. I don't know why travel and medical is on the same budget, but there you go. It costs a lot. Wherever they go, they have to buy multiple hotel rooms, usually an entire floor for security purposes. So they spend a lot in travel. And then for the rest of their life, they get about $200,000 a year just as a thank you for being president. So it might only be $400,000 a year, while you're president for 4 years, but then $200,000 for the rest of your life. That's really nice. And then they get a budget of $150,000 to hire staff after they retire. So they get plenty of staff while they're president. And then after they retire, they get to hire staff to work for them. And I don't really know what they'd be doing. Massages and stuff. And then they get Secret Service protection at no cost of their own, and plenty of other ex-president perks for 10 years, so that expires. And then they can hire their own personal security if they want. So when I see how much the president makes, my jaw drops, thinking that I'm not going to make a tenth of his money and perks ever. But really, when you look at the way other executive officers are paid, that pales in comparison. A lot of presidents were already millionaires, and a lot of them take a pay cut to become president. Here's a graph of how much people make, and the head of Discovery Channel, or Discovery Communications, David Zaslav, makes $156 million a year. Considering the president makes a little under $500,000 a year, we're talking 300 times as much. He makes 300 times as much money as the U.S. president. Les Moonves, the head of CBS, makes more than 100 times as much as the president makes. Same thing with Philippe Dumont from Viacom, about 100 times as much as the president makes. Robert Iger of Walt Disney Corporation, and this is several years ago. This is like 2015 or something. So I'm sure Rob Iger has been paid a lot more than that recently. A lot of these other people, Yahoo, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, Comcast, Time Warner, being paid about 100 times as much as the president. 10 times as much as the president would be $4 million. So 100 times would be $40 million. So imagine being the president and being one of the poorest people in the room. It's crazy. Many presidents also work insane hours. Not all of them have, but some presidents have worked 70-hour work weeks easy or even more. They are also under extreme pressure to make extreme decisions that affect the lives of hundreds of millions of Americans and then billions of other people around the world. So it is a very responsibility-heavy job, And because of the heavy responsibility, you expect it to pay very, very well. The president is also the commander in chief. So, first job, he executes the law. Second job, he is the head of the military. He is the commander in chief of the U.S. military, and that's all the armed forces. I believe the Constitution just mentions the Army and Navy, but of course, we understand that to mean the Air Force and now the Space Force as well. Civilian control of the military is very uncommon. That hardly ever happens. Usually it's the other way around. We have the people with the guns making the laws. And might makes right. I have the guns, I have the army, therefore do what I say, and if you don't, I will shoot you. That is incredibly common worldwide. And yet a civilian say, hey, people with the guns, do what I say because I'm in charge, and you just got to do it. And then the people with guns obey the law, obey their commander. That is weird. That is uncommon. When you look at a gathering of world leaders, look at how many wear a military uniform versus how many of them wear civilian clothes. And the ones wearing military uniforms, you can tell those are the ones who say, do what I say or I'll shoot you. America is a democracy. We do not obey the laws out of threat of death or jailing. We obey the laws because it's the right thing to do, because we have decided to vote on the laws and then obey the laws whether we get our way or not. If a military officer argues with the president can fire them easily. When General MacArthur argued with Truman about the course of the Korean War, Truman fired him. And MacArthur was one of our best generals ever. He was amazing. He won Congressional Medal of Honor in World War I and in World War II. He led the fight in World War II in the Pacific. He did incredibly well. He did very well in Korea. And he was very good at his job. What he was really bad at was following orders, which is strange for a general. But he thought he was smarter than everyone, so he thought he always knew what was best, and that his bosses were stupid. So he often argued with his bosses or just disobeyed them. And the only reason he stayed in the military and wasn't fired earlier was because he was always right, and he always did know how to win the war and always won amazing victories. But by the time he argues with the president says, I'm not taking your nonsense, you're fired. And America booed that decision. They love MacArthur, but too bad. Truman is in charge. You obey your president. Just recently, I think I read yesterday that there was a military officer who refused to obey President Biden's rules about vaccines, and so he got fired. It's like, yeah, you don't have to like the law, but if you're in the military, you do have to obey your commanders, including the commander in chief. And if you don't obey, you're not going to be in the military for very long. The president is allowed to use the military even outside of a declaration of war. It takes a while for Congress to make any decision. So if there is an emergency, the president is allowed to command the military to respond even before war is declared. And we did that after Pearl Harbor. We declared war very quickly after Pearl Harbor. The very next day, right? Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day that will last in infamy. But even before FDR made his famous speech to Congress asking to declare war, he sent out memos to all of the naval ships in the area saying, be on the lookout, we are at war with Japan, shoot on sight, or probably more likely run away because they're going to shoot you at sight. So he was allowed to do that, even though he's not allowed to declare war himself. President Bush formed a coalition of the willing to invade Iraq even before he got congressional permission to do so. He started getting these people on board before Congress wrote a law saying he was allowed to do that. And we see here all the blue and dark blue and light blue members here versus red, Iraq. I believe all the yellow people sent money but no troops. All the blue people sent troops. Pretty cool. So Congress went on to write a law clarifying exactly what the war powers of the president are. You can read on page 251 about that. And it said the president can fight a war, prosecute a war, if, number one, Congress declares war, then the president is 100% in charge of how that war is fought, where certain targets are, rules of engagement, what weapons to use. They're in charge of all that. Number two, Congress doesn't have to declare war if they pass a law allowing military action. And we have not declared war since World War II, not officially at least. Every other time, Congress has just allowed military action. And that's been highly controversial because why are we not declaring war? If we're shooting them and they're shooting us, shouldn't Congress do its job and declare war? I don't know. That's my opinion, at least, that Congress should take a vote instead of just saying, well, let the president have all the responsibility. And lastly, if we are attacked, the president can decide what to do about that in the meantime while Congress decides whether or not to declare war. That allows for split-second decisions instead of waiting a month or two. You can quickly retaliate. So in case of a nuclear attack, we would not declare war. If we detected that nukes are lifting off from Russia, we would retaliate with our own nukes, and everyone in the world would die without anyone declaring war. The president has a lot of power about intelligence, meaning spies, and security, meaning how to secure America, how to keep America safe. So like border security, a lot of those policies are made by the president and his people, not necessarily by Congress. Covert operations, spy missions. Usually the president and the executive branch take care of that without any knowledge in Congress or by anyone else. Congress has what's called a black account, all these different black accounts, which gives funding, which means they will give, here's $20 million that we're giving to the CIA. And the CIA says, thank you. And that money is not budgeted for anything. It's just money given to the CIA, no questions asked. And then they use that to, send a helicopter full of spies off to rappel down a building and blow something up somewhere. I don't know. Did you hear Israel sent a drone to go blow up a nuclear power plant in Iran? They sent a drone. They also had a spy who convinced a worker at this power plant to smuggle in a box of explosives that they were able to then remote control detonate. So I don't think Iran's getting a nuke anytime too soon. The president is also the head of the ambassadors. He is the head of America, so he is the chief diplomat. Congress shares some of this power as well. For instance, all ambassadors are chosen by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. But the Secretary of State works for the president chooses the Secretary of State and appoints all those ambassadors. There are plenty of times where the president of the United States and the head of another foreign country like Putin of Russia or Queen Elizabeth or whoever, probably not the Queen, but the Prime Minister of England, or these other people will just make a handshake agreement, and that will change foreign policy without any congressional approval. So Congress is supposed to approve of any treaties that are made, but if it is less formal than a treaty, then it just requires handshake approval by the president. Sometimes they will get that in writing as well. Okay, we're going to end with a few extras. First of all, the title of the president. I believe it was Mr. Monroe who wanted to call him His Majesty, the President of the United States and the Defender of the Rights of the Same. And people said that's stupid. Other people just wanted to call him His Majesty the President or even Your Highness. And they decided to scrap that because it seemed too formal and the president was supposed to be a man of the people. So they decided to just call him Mr. President. And they decided that's the title, Mr. President or Sir. Even ex-presidents are called Mr. President, just like senators and governors. Former senators and governors are still called governor or senator, and that their term is up. That's interesting. Here's something on the limits of presidential power. The limits of presidential power remain a constant source of controversy, mostly because the Constitution gives very vague rules about what the president can and cannot do. Some people argue that the president is limited to constitutional and statutory powers. Others believe that the president has any power that's not specifically denied to him. Unlike the Constitution's instructions for Congress, its instructions for the president do not include a necessary and proper clause, so there's no elastic clause for the president. Many presidents claim executive privilege for certain actions and decisions, meaning you can't get me in trouble, I'm the president, so I can do what I want. During the Watergate scandal, President Nixon claimed that the executive privilege of confidentiality allowed him to refuse a subpoena to turn over recordings of conversations he had with his advisors. His lawyer said that number one, inherent privileges flow from the president's enumerated powers, and number two, the separation of powers protects the president from judicial prosecution. So I don't have to cooperate with Congress if I don't want to, because I'm the president, I can do what I want. And of course, that didn't fly very well, and they were going to impeach him and maybe even send him to jail, but he resigned first. In United States versus Nixon in 1974, Supreme Court Chief Justice Burger wrote, "Nowhere in the Constitution is there any explicit reference to the privilege of confidentiality, yet to the extent this interest relates to the effective discharge of a presidential powers, it is constitutionally based." That is, if you are actually doing right and doing something that is your job, you're allowed to have this privilege. But breaking into the Democratic headquarters has nothing to do with your job as president, so that's not privileged. Does that make sense? If it had to do with your job, it would be privileged, but because it's not your job as president to break into your opponent's house, it's not privileged. He admitted that in matters of national security and diplomacy, those might require secrecy, but also stated that the generalized assertion of privilege must yield to the demonstrated specific need for evidence in the pending criminal trial. So if you're being brought up to trial, the need for evidence outweighs the need for privacy, and you have to give up those rights. Speaking of executive privilege, President Trump is continuing to, and his allies are continuing to claim executive privilege to not cooperate with the January 6th proceedings. And the Supreme Court has recently ruled that an ex-president does not have presidential privilege anymore. I believe the quote was, "We only have one president at a time." So you cannot claim that privilege if you're not even the president. Especially, not only if you're a former president, you can't claim it, but if you used to work for a president, you are not privileged in any way, shape, or form, and have to cooperate with the Supreme Court, have to do what they say. The Supreme Court is supreme after all.